Hello everyone, my name is Ruth and I am an Australian registered migration agent and a lawyer or solicitor of the Supreme and High Court of Australia. Well, today I would like to share with you about the exemptions for the general residence requirement for an Australian citizenship application. Now please note that the information in this video is general information only. Do not treat it as legal advice. If you require specific advice for your case, please do not hesitate to contact us. In regard to the general eligibility, an applicant for an Australian citizenship application must be either a permanent resident or an eligible New Zealand citizen, and usually that means that they have to have been living in Australia since before 2001 and continue to maintain Australian residency. And generally an applicant must be in Australia when the application is decided. They must have spent time in Australia and know about Australia, and they intend to live in Australia and maintain that commitment to Australia. So the general residence requirement requires an applicant to have lived in Australia for the past 4 years just before they apply. They must be a permanent resident or an eligible New Zealand citizen for the past 12 months just before the time of application. And they must have not been away from Australia for 12 months in total in the last 4 years, including no more than 90 days in the last 12 months. So, which means an applicant has to be living in Australia for 3 out of the last 4 years, and in the last 12 months, not be overseas for more than 90 days. Now for children ages 16 or 17 years old, if meeting this requirement would cause significant hardship, then generally immigration is quite happy to provide an exemption, but you need to provide proof. Children under 16 do not generally need to meet the general residence requirement. So in regard to general exemptions, if someone is under 16 years old, or if they were born to a former Australian citizen who lost their citizenship before 4th of April 2002, or if they were born in Papua before 16 September 1975, and one of the parents was born in Australia and was an Australian citizen at the time the applicant was born, then generally you do not need to meet the general residence requirement. There are other exemptions. For example, if yourself or your family are a member of the Australian Defence Force, so it would usually be a family because you have to be an Australian citizen to be in the Australian Defence Force. But if you have a family member who is in the Australian Defence Force, then you may get an exemption from the residency requirement. The other limit of exemption to residence requirement is ministerial discretion. So the minister can actually vary the residence requirement in certain situations. The situations will really depend on whether you are overseas or in Australia at the time immigration decides on your application. If you are in Australia at the time immigration decides on your application, then they may decide to treat the following periods as lawful residence. For example, if you were in Australia unlawfully as the result of an administrative error, or if you were in Australia lawfully but not as a permanent resident as a result of an administrative error, which is through no fault of your own, or if you were in Australia lawfully but not as a permanent resident, and not treating it as a period of permanent residence would cause you to suffer significant hardship or disadvantage. So that's really open to your argument and how you persuade immigration. Or if you were in prison or a psychiatric institution, then that period may be counted towards the residency requirement, and not treating it as a period of permanent residence would be unreasonable, taking into account the circumstances that led to your confinement. Now that said, you still have to actually meet the character requirements. So if you were recently released from prison, then that might be a little bit difficult. You might have to wait a couple of years and show that you are a person of good character before you can apply. Now, if you are outside Australia when immigration decides on your application, then the minister may count some of the periods you have spent outside Australia as lawful resident in Australia if you have spent time outside Australia as a permanent resident with your Australian citizen spouse or partner. Or if you are the surviving spouse or partner of an Australian citizen and have a close and continuing association with Australia. Or if you spend time outside Australia and are a permanent resident in an interdependent relationship with an Australian citizen and you have had a close and continuing association with Australia. Now, I would like to share with you the special residence requirement. So there is a special residence consideration that immigration has put forth, and this could be activities supported by particular organizations. So for example, if you wish to engage in activities that are supported by certain organizations such as Australian Olympic and Paralympics committees, Tennis Australia, Cricket Australia, or a federal government agency, then the special residence requirement may apply to you. You must have been living in Australia on a valid visa that allows permanent residency for 2 years immediately before you apply. And during those 2 years, you must have been lawfully present in Australia for at least 180 days, including at least 90 days during the past 12 months. So that's fantastic, because if you've been involved in certain organizations that are sports related or with the federal government, then your residence requirement is actually essentially shortened from 4 years to 2 years. And you really only have to show that you've been living in Australia for 180 days in that 2 years. Another consideration that immigration will take into account would be if you've got work that requires you to travel overseas. Okay? The special residence requirement may apply to you if you have been engaged in particular kinds of work. Your employer can show that you've worked in the occupation for at least 2 in the last 4 years, and you were required to travel outside Australia for that work. You must have held a valid Australian visa for 4 years immediately before applying, including 1 year as a permanent resident immediately before applying. You must also have been living in Australia for a total of 16 months. So that is 480 days during the last 4 years before you apply, with at least 4 months, which is 120 days of that time in the year immediately before your application. The list of relevant occupations for this particular special residence requirement would be if you are a member of the crew of a ship or aircraft, if you're a worker on a resource installation or a sea installation, if you are a chief executive officer or executive manager of an S&P/ASX All Australian 200 listed company, or if you're a scientist employed by an Australian university who has attained PhD in their field of specialty and is undertaking research and development for the benefit of Australia, or a Commonwealth scientific and industrial research organisation, or in a medical research institute, which is a member of the Association of Australian Medical Research Institutes, AAMRI. So that's if you're a scientist working for any of the organizations mentioned above. Or if you are a medical specialist, internationally renowned in your field, and you're a fellow of an organization listed in Schedule 4, Part 1 of the Health Insurance Regulations 1975, Commonwealth, and you hold a relevant qualification in relation to the organization. Or if you are a person who is a writer, or you are engaged in the visual or performing arts, and you're the holder of or has held a distinguished talent visas. So if you fall under any of these categories, then immigration may consider granting you the special residence requirement if you are required to travel overseas. So if you have a job that does not fall under what we have mentioned, then this may not be applicable to you, and you may wish to consider applying for an exemption under either because you've got a family or Australian citizen spouse or partner. Well, that concludes the information that I wanted to share in this video. Please note that the information in this video is general information only. It is not legal advice. I have actually prepared another video which talks a little bit about the general overview of Australian citizenship applications. You're most welcome to check that out. But if you need help with your citizenship application, or if you're stuck in a position where you're not sure if you're eligible and you might need to plead this special residence requirement, please don't hesitate to contact us on the email address below. And we wish you the very best in your Australian citizenship pursuit. Thank you.